All right. So number three, I'm putting water filtration. And really to understand why this is so important, you have to understand why cities are so important. So Ed Glazer, the premier urban economist, says cities are humankind's greatest invention. All right. They essentially, organize activity and spur activity. And they're just wonderful. Um, and they're growing in importance. And so here we have the urbanization rates of the U.S. by region, and you can see that the U.S. is going from initially predominantly rural nation to a predominantly urban nation. Okay, this is a very loose definition of urban area. But if you do say areas with 50,000 residents or more, you'll see a similar pattern. Essentially, all of the U.S.'s, or not all, but the majority of the U.S.'s economic activity is concentrated in cities. So this, the higher the peak, the more economic activity. And so you can see really the U.S. in terms of like what it produces, that's really coming from the coast over here, the eastern seaboard, and then we have scattered cities throughout the middle of the country. Atlanta, the Texas Triangle, Miami. Where's Chicago? Is that Chicago? Yeah, I think that's Chicago. Yes, that is Chicago. Sorry. Don't know my Midwest geography as well as I should. All right. And so what is it about cities that are so important? Well, basically, what a city does is the origins of cities are these first two: trade and increasing returns of scale. So you think about your oldest cities, they're typically trading cities. They're there to kind of organize that activity. Usually the goods are coming from the countryside. There's like a central place to ship it out. You think of the U.S.'s earliest large cities. If you go look at the U.S.'s earliest large cities, it's New York, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. All of those are really just centers of trade, places where goods coming from the hinterlands are coming out to be shipped, and those are cities that are uniquely organized or uniquely situated to facilitate trade. The other reason cities exist is increasing returns of scale. All right, what does this mean? This is like a fancy econ word. Don't worry too much about it. What it means is just as an organization gets larger or a factory gets larger, it gets more efficient. So you can think of, this is like specialization, working in teams, that sort of thing. Cities offer that. You can put a bunch of people together and you get this increasing returns of scale. All right. That is the origin of cities, why we have cities, in the past. But in the present, what is becoming really important is this thing called agglomeration. Okay. And so what agglomeration? Basically, it's a big word that essentially covers lots of different aspects of cities. The technical term is external returns of scale, whereas this one right here is internal returns of scale. So returns of scale inside of a firm. This is returns of scale outside of a firm. Don't worry too much about it. That's why they're all grouped under this category of agglomeration. So there's cost advantages. What we mean here is in a city, a bunch of different firms locating together. That's really where the advantage of a city comes from, is a bunch of different firms that are in similar industries or the same industry locating next to each other. So there's cost advantages of this. Basically, you can get cheaper deals from your suppliers, but really we have the spillovers. Spillovers are going to be important. Knowledge that's produced in one firm or in one industry, if it's in a city, can easily spill over into the other because of just that proximity. There's also really, really good labor market advantages. If you have a big labor force, you are likely to find the right candidate. So we get really good matching between firms and workers, and then the workers can move from one firm to another easily, which is an advantage for the workers in terms of like having job security. If I lose my job, there's another one over here, or I can play employers off of each other to get a higher wage. Okay, so this agglomeration, what we call agglomeration, has really only grown in importance, or it's really taken off in importance because those spillovers, those knowledge spillovers, are really important in a high human capital, high technology, industry and society. And these labor market advantages, where people move jobs much more frequently, That's also important. So both these have really grown. And the way you want to think about it, like, okay, what's going on in cities, or a helpful example as to why they're important, like think of music, all right? Every once in a while, like a music scene will develop in a city and then it will completely dominate. And it's like, the musicians obviously are talented and special, but really what was special is that environment that created that music, the competition between the musicians that spurred them to do even better. The knowledge spillovers. Oh, hey, they're doing that over there. We can also incorporate that and kind of change this music and further it. That economies of scale, the fact that you have access, if you're in a city, to a large audience. So like think through history. We have jazz in New Orleans at the beginning of the 20th century. We have hip hop coming out of New York in the 70s and 80s. We have grunge in the 90s. You have punk and ska from Orange County in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so these are all like music scenes that like had this, maybe not the last one, but that had like this extreme effect on the culture. Or Motown in Detroit, another example. And so in like that is like encapsulated the benefits of a city. The spillovers of one musician to another, learning from each other, competing with one another, being able to utilize those large crowds that cities bring. So, you want to think about that. That's maybe the most relatable one, but you want to think about that in all sorts of industries. That's what cities offer. And that's why they are so important. And a nice illustration of this is this case study of Silicon Valley and Route 128. Okay. So what is Route 128? It is America's old technology region. So it's this Route 128 in Boston. And it was America's technology region before Silicon Valley, all right, basically in the 50s. And so what's interesting here is you want to think about, just think about like why Silicon Valley is where Silicon Valley is. Like what's going on? Why is like our tech sector centered in Silicon Valley? And what's interesting is it was not always there. It was in Route 128. It was outside of Boston. So you have an educated workforce, coming out of Stanford and Berkeley, essentially those two big universities, providing an educated workforce. Obviously you have good climate, but you also have an environment, a cultural environment that allows for spillovers. And so what's interesting is, so Route 128 and Silicon Valley are essentially very similar in that they, you have your tech sector locating there, you're going to have those cost advantages by having those intermediate producers nearby. You're going to get a skilled labor force, and you're going to get all the benefits that brings. So in Silicon Valley, you get Stanford and Berkeley. In Boston, obviously, you have Harvard, MIT, and a bunch of other universities. The difference between these two areas is going to be on spillovers. Essentially, Silicon Valley is going to allow and encourage spillovers, whereas Route 128 is going to shut this down. All right. So I already covered what Route 128 is. Okay. All right. And so it's initially the technology region, and it's really focused on government contracts. This is like the height of the Cold War. This is like in the 50s. So you have these big defense manufacturers, Raytheon, DEC, GE, all located there. And what happens is there becomes this culture of secrecy, partly, what's going on? Okay, there we go. Sorry, my computer just did something weird. Don't know what's happening. Maybe it's overheating because it is really hot in this room. Anyways, you have this like secrecy culture. They don't switch firms that much often, and legally they have a non-compete clause. So they have this non-compete clause where you're actually not allowed to go to a competitor. And you have an environment where failure is frowned upon. So you have all these things going on, which is really going to shut down that spillover channel between firms. The opposite really is what happens in Silicon Valley. Got a lot of small firms. There's a very loose corporate culture. Ideas are shared across firms. You actually have examples of engineers calling engineers from other companies to say, hey, can you help me with this problem? In California legally bans these non-compete clauses. And so you can leave your company, go work for another one. And there's like a lot of turnover. And so what happens is you get all that knowledge spillover between the firms. Here we have some quotes from where this is taken from this article by this book that she wrote. And so we have, these are just quotes kind of showing that culture, and also failure is a badge of honor in Silicon Valley. Like, it's okay to fail. All right. And so we can see basically in terms of tech employment, Silicon Valley overtakes Route 128 in the 1970s. And obviously this has just continued apace. All right. So all of that is just to set the stage for how important cities are, for how important they are driving innovation, driving growth, human flourishing. Like, living in a city is, exciting, but it really provides you with all sorts of opportunities that you wouldn't have if you lived in, the middle of nowhere. These kind of happenstance. Oh, hey, I know this person that knows this person. Hey, I can help you out. It's why we locate in cities. So really what this lecture is about is kind of the importance of cities, and this water filtration that I'm putting at number 3 really allows cities to grow. So prior to 1900, cities were bad for you. The mortality rates were higher in urban areas than they were in rural areas. So cities were deadly, all right? And this goes way back, like cities historically have been more deadly than the rural area. Disease spreads easier. Essentially, we don't really have good sewage. So disease spreads because of proximity and because of poor hygiene. And then also in the 19th century, you get factories that are very, very, that have lots of pollution. So for all of the 19th century, practically, cities are much more deadly than the rural areas. But basically, because of these investments in public health, and I'll link to this video, which kind of is real fun video that looks at sort of that initial detective work to figure out what was so deadly about cities. By the other Jon Snow, not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, the other Jon Snow that was not ruined in the final season. He remains, this Jon Snow, the Dr. Jon Snow, remains a paragon of history. All right. So what happens is there's these large public investments. So here's an example of innovation really coming from the public sector, not the private sector, that the government's making these investments in public, what we call public goods. And so they make these water supply investments, filtration and sewage systems and treatments, clean water supply, filtration and chlorination. And what you can see is, just looking at the stats, this is, I just have a few examples. Baltimore and Cincinnati, both of them, basically their death rates from this particular disease, typhoid fever, goes down to almost 0. Well, we can look at a wide range of other infectious diseases. This water investments, really drove that down to where we get to the present, where urban areas are actually healthier than rural areas. Now, this is often driven by selection, not necessarily the public health investments, but the public health investments really set that stage such that cities were now a much safer place to live in terms of the disease environment. All right, that really facilitated that initial migration to cities that took place in the 20th century. As the 20th century ramps up, the U.S. becomes much more urban. Now, in the 20th century, cities, there's kind of a whole separate story about cities in the 20th century in terms of suburbanization and segregation. And the reading will kind of deal with that, and how cities locked certain groups out of the opportunity that they provided. All right, but cities and water filtration, number 3, number 2 coming up.